cloud-based medicine. You're going to end up having a robotic share of the elderly in nursing homes, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have automated driverless transportation. More to go on forever. They have more than forever. It's just have to plan. Yeah, but they don't last long. Okay, so they'll, unless you get major power problems. But that's not going to happen for the major power problems. But the interesting feature of chaos is five different domains. Some of them that don't produce real combat casualties are not well, that's interesting in its own right. But the interesting piece in that is very high. Think what happens. Which is a high-tech business already working somewhere else. I live around, oh, I'm going to say 700. And that one hit was a month ago. Now, that's what, well, one of the reasons it will produce a profile like response and all of these things. But then the next issue becomes one of saying, okay, what happens if it's a combat resistant ship and fires out? Devastation. How about Texas City, Texas, 1946? Thousand plus U.S. casualties for the Navy ship flew sky high. That was that was nitrate, fertilizer, gas jacking. In this case, they tell us that rainfall don't do the soil for high explosives in populated areas. Yeah. What got covered was the marathon market. Just because not everybody was there. Nothing wasn't there. It was simply that the coverage was there. How would you know the difference? No, it was because of the coverage of marathon. There's just no media. No, there's still no coverage of marathon. All we did was take place. All I did was just switch the news. How they ignored 10 times the casualties. Oh, well, turn the board here. Turn the board.
No, no, I enjoyed it, thank you.
What are you doing in here? This is.
He's part of the Naval Department. Yes, exactly. That's what it started off. I don't know what that means. Is there something? So is there there's a right shipment and a left shipment and a mid shipment? Is that what it is? What is it? Four aft and mid. There you go. So where's the four midman? Oh, it is? And the aft?
Should be good. When he comes in. Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We would remind everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind to check mobile devices that have been silenced or turned off. We should begin momentarily. My colleague, Dr. Thomas Callender, will be introducing our special guest. Mr. Callender is Senior Research Fellow for Defense Programs here in our Center for National Defense. Before joining us at Heritage, he served for 5 years as Director of Capabilities in the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy. He has also worked as a Senior Maritime Analyst for Delex Systems, as well as a Senior Strategy Consultant for Toffler Associates. And Mr. Callender served for 20 years in the Navy as a submarine officer. We will begin momentarily. Thank you.
My glasses here. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you for joining me here this morning and welcoming the Navy's 31st Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, to discuss the Navy the nation needs. The Navy maintains a constant enduring presence of almost 100 ships and submarines forward deployed around the globe to deter potential adversaries, reassure our allies, and ensure the freedom of the global maritime commons for all nations. The challenges facing the 21st century Navy have never been greater. As formidable as these security threats are, there are those who would argue that the greatest challenge to our nation's Navy has come from our own Congress. Over the decade of continuing resolutions and fiscal constraints of the Budget Control Act have had a cumulative effect of degrading the capacity, capabilities, and readiness of the U.S. Navy. In light of these increasingly complex maritime security environment and the recently released National Defense Strategy, CNO's discussion today could not be more timely. As a retired submariner myself, I'm greatly honored to be able to host the CNO today. I, too, was also a physics major, and we also share another common piece in our history that Admiral will talk about. Admiral John Richardson, graduate from the United States Naval Academy in 1982 with a Bachelor of Science in Physics. He holds master degrees in electrical engineering from MIT and Woods Hole and national security strategy from the National War College. At sea, Admiral Richardson served on numerous submarines and commanded USS Honolulu and was awarded the Vice Admiral Stockdale Award for his time in command.
Thanks. All right. All right. Hey, welcome, everybody. Thanks so much. I want to, thanks, Tom. Thanks for that generous introduction. And we do go way back, as Tom alluded to, back to the Naval Academy, fellow physics majors. I copied Tom's papers a lot to get through here, and also rode together. So it's just a lot of time staring at the back of each other's heads in the boat. So Tom, also want to thank you and the foundation for being so flexible with our schedule and putting this event together. And I'll tell you what, in terms of events, there are, as I've said in a couple of other times, there's sort of, they go in three categories, right? You get a lot of invitations, a remarkable number of invitations, and there are some that you don't want to do and you're not going to do. You just sort of say no. And then there are some that you'd rather not do, but you probably have to do, and so you say yes reluctantly. But then there are some that you really sort of shop it around for, that you really want to do. And this was one of those events. I really am eager to be here, and I want to blast through, given I'm just looking around the crowd, there's people who know as much or more about naval strategy than I do in the crowd, and I want to get through my remarks as quickly as possible, get to the question and answer period, which I think will be a lot of fun. And again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here at Heritage, who's, the foundation itself has just a firm reputation for supporting national security and the Navy in particular. Just start, before I get into my remarks, about just a quick operational update. As I speak to you now, my brief this morning showed that we have 92 ships forward deployed in the United States Navy today. About 60,000, a little more than 60,000 sailors forward deployed. That includes 2 underway carrier strike groups, and of course the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, the forward deployed strike group in Japan. 2 amphibious ready groups with their embarked Marine Expeditionary Unit. Of course, those strike groups come with their embarked air wing, which is really the fighting arm of the carrier. 14 attack submarines deployed today, which is a bit of a high point. Our normal force offering there is between 10 and 12 normally. SSBNs on patrol, as they have been 100% of the time since 1960. And that's an important part. Maintaining that alert status is an important part of our program going forward. And we have 6 cruisers and destroyers on BMD station. So, as Tom said, our discussion today comes at a critical time for our Navy as we face a very dynamic and changing maritime environment. And it comes on the cusp of some important sort of annual events as well, as we get ready to release the budget for 19. Obviously, won't discuss the details of that here until that's released, but it will be talking about some of the strategic underpinning that informs that budget. And as we're talking about strategy, another reality is that the National Security Strategy has just been recently released, as has the National Defense Strategy just a couple of weeks ago. And Secretary Mattis in that strategy provides a much needed framework. In fact, if you think about the Navy the nation needs, and there's sort of an ellipsis at the end, for what? Well, the Navy the nation needs to fulfill the maritime responsibilities in the National Defense Strategy, right? So we have one strategy for the department, that is the NDS, and this could be seen almost as part of the maritime component of that strategy. So we're using the tagline, the nation the Navy needs. So as I said, we'll get through a quick discussion of the security environment, and then we'll get to questions. And so I thought I would throw up a couple of charts. I don't want to get too heavy into the charts. This room looks a lot bigger on the pictures, but so it's kind of an intimate setting. I don't feel too bad spending some time on a couple of charts. And if you look at a map of the world, well, this isn't an uncommon format for that depiction, right? And so you see a lot of geography, right? Most of the political maps that you see are maps that focus on the land part of the globe. And so you've got both the political and geographic things represented here, cities, towns, roads, those sorts of features. not uncommon, as I said. And then there's this, blue stuff that connects it. And I will tell you that this is kind of how I see it, right? And so I start with the blue. In fact, it's not that. That's just the template on which I see it. I see it more like that, okay, which is a depiction of just how busy things are in the maritime and getting busier all the time. So we'll talk in the context of the return to great power competition this morning. And by virtue of that word return, we'll go back to the last time we were in great power competition and just make some comparisons. Because I would say this, it's just not a rerun of that last time. And I would say the last time we were in great power competition was on the order of about 25 years ago, right, the Cold War. Since that time, in the last 25 years or so, maritime traffic, just ships on the ocean, has increased 400%. And if you consider the fact that people have been going to sea for tens of thousands of years, right? 10,000 years is probably not a bad estimate. To see a four-fold increase in the last quarter century, just think about what that means for us in terms of just managing that amount of traffic. And it's fueled the roughly doubling of the GDP of the globe, right? So a lot of that prosperity has been manifested and enabled by maritime traffic. Megacities continue to grow, expected to grow from 31 to 41 by 2030. The vast majority of those megacities within 100 miles of the coastline. We're turning to the sea more and more for our food, our sustenance, both carbohydrate and protein. And aquaculture, as it's called, has increased 13-fold and is expected to continue that way going into the future. I don't know if this have a laser. I don't know. Anyway, on this chart are depicted a number of things. So you can see in white, there are the sea lanes. These diamond shapes are just another feature of the dynamism in the maritime domain, as are the purple shaded areas, which is technology has given us access to resources on the seafloor that we just simply never had before, okay? And so now we've got access to oil, natural gas, other natural resources, minerals. The lines that run roughly parallel to the sea lanes, but they're colored in gold or orange, signify the undersea cable network, okay? This is this network, this infrastructure that's undersea on which rides about 99% of international internet traffic, okay? And so when we talk about a cloud, we're really looking in the wrong direction from my standpoint, right? It's your cloud, you look up, most of that information is in the sea. We should be talking about a lake, okay? So help me there. I'm just trying to change this whole, not cloud computing, lake computing, okay? And then another thing that's depicted here are the polar ice caps up near the top of the chart. And those are the smallest they've been in that period of time, in that 25 years since the last time we've been in great power competition, giving rise to, again, access to more resources, giving rise to sea lanes of communication that simply just weren't there before. And so given these dynamics in the maritime and others, a balanced strategy, a balanced strategic approach is more important than ever. And our priorities have been very clearly defined by the National Security Strategy, which directs us to protect America, promote American prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and advance American influence throughout the world. And the National Defense Strategy picks up, describes the imperative for confronting these challenges challenges head on, right? We're going to compete, we're going to deter, and we're going to win, centered on three major lines of effort, which are to build a more lethal force, to continue to strengthen our alliances and even attract new partners, so expand and deepen those alliances, and then to look to reform the department in terms of the way that we do our business and acquire the material with which we do our business. And so this is also the handing off point, right? The Navy the nation needs picks up that agenda, that call to action. And I want to talk in terms, just quickly, in terms of how I see defining naval power, all right? And there's been a good consensus, including the consensus by the Heritage Foundation and many other studies over the last roughly 2 years that have all converged on the conclusion that we need more naval power to meet our responsibilities to the nation, okay? And so I want to talk about the concept of naval power. I'm going to break it down into a few dimensions that hang together, all right? It's very difficult to talk about coherent naval power if you start stripping these out and disconnect them from one another. You must keep them in balance to provide this sense of integrity or wholeness. And so one dimension is one way to increase naval power is just to build a bigger fleet, okay? And a number of those studies that I alluded to talk about that capacity. And in fact, all of those studies converged on a Navy in the neighborhood of 300, 355 ships. Our force structure assessment did that, and there were a number of other studies that went that, and the Congress picked up on that, and the National Defense Authorization Act has a statement in there that we will do everything we can to achieve a 355 ship Navy, subject to appropriation and authorization and all those things. And so this idea of the numbers of platforms, right, not a great leap of intuition that a bigger Navy is a more powerful Navy. A second component, a second dimension of naval power would be to build a better fleet. And so if you modernize each one of those platforms and other ways with better systems, make each one of those things more capable, then that means each one being more capable, but they sum up also to more naval power, a more capable fleet. And we're actually on the cusp of some very intriguing technologies that would not only increase our capability, I would think very much, but also could do so and get us on the correct side of the cost curve. And so I'm looking hard at things like directed energy, high power microwave, lasers, electromagnetic maneuver warfare, and other innovative ways. Also in this group, better fleet, this capability dimension, we might want to consider things like unmanned. And so depending upon how we think about unmanned, some of those unmanned platforms may be kind of in the platform dimension, many of them here in the capability dimension. And so we're looking hard at building out our family of unmanned underwater systems, surface systems, and air systems. Third dimension of power, naval power as we think about it, is to take those platforms with their inherent capability, which we can increase, and then network them together. So this third component is a network fleet. So we have sort of a bigger fleet, a more capable fleet, and now a network fleet. And there are plenty of examples in history where just the power of networking things together creatively, adaptively, brings actually more power to that force. And so we can talk about some of those historical examples, but it makes intuitive sense as well, right? It sort of checks with the chart that if you're able to share data more across the force, you're able to respond to that awareness with more agility, you can be a more powerful fleet. Not talked about enough is what I'll call the fourth dimension, which is a more talented fleet. And if you think about growing these other dimensions, growing naval power, at some point we're going to have to man that fleet with sailors. And so there's also sort of a number of sailors dimension, but also the skill sets with which those sailors are going to need different than the ones that we have right now, right? And so particularly as you think about, well, go back to that network fleet. Right, we're talking about sharing and assimilating, sifting through vast amounts of data that come from growing sets or networks and the such. And so, as we get a bigger fleet, okay, we're going to need more sailors. As we get a better fleet, we're going to need sailors that are trained a little bit differently than we train them right now. Those systems demand different skills. As we consider a network fleet, we're going to need some help, right? And so this is the realm of artificial intelligence, of learning algorithms, of figuring out the optimum way to team together the people, our sailors, and machine assistants, okay, to be able to sort through that amount of data and get to those decision-relevant bits of information as quickly as possible. Competing in that orient and decide part of the OODA loop, right, so that we can beat the competition in that part of that loop. Fifth dimension is what I'm calling the agile fleet. This is an appreciation for the concepts of operations with which we operate that fleet, the C2 structures with which we command and control that fleet. And so once we have built this fleet, we've modernized it, we've networked it, we've manned it with appropriately trained sailors with the assistance they need, we've got to figure out how we're going to operate it. And there's always, as you know, a dynamic tension between sort of the technology that's available to the fleet and the ConOps with which we operate that fleet. And so those two, I don't know if it's a tension, maybe it's an interplay is a better way to describe it. As more possibilities become evident through technology, then you adapt your ConOps. That feeds back to the technology space to say, if I only had this, I could do so much more. And so there's a great reinforcing dynamism. And so as we consider things like distributed maritime operations, we're really looking for a fleet that much more leverages the global maneuver power that is inherent in a Navy, right? And so as you think about this type of an environment, it's the only thing that really structures that environment are natural choke points, okay? So, and some of those have been around since the United States Navy started 242 years ago. So, and you can see them up there, Gibraltar, the Suez, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca. All of these choke points sort of define our structures. What it is not responsive to is artificial lines, right? So combatant commander boundaries and those sorts of things. We have to make sure that we preserve the inherent agility of the Navy as it maneuvers. We don't think so much in terms of where a particular naval capability is, right? But not only where it is, but then it's only a few days away from wherever it might need to be, okay? There's this idea of tethers rather than, a 1 or a 0 presence, all right? And then final dimension. This is getting complicated, so the only thing I could have done worse is to have every one of these things on a slide. So, the final dimension is, everything I've talked about right now is sort of a fleet in being, potential energy, if you will. Until you get that force out and you train it, and this is the ready fleet, okay? And so turning all of that potential power, that potential energy into kinetic energy requires readiness. And that means you got to go out, you've got to steam, you've got to fly. You've got to have your magazines full. You've got to have your logistics element in place. You've got to have your parts. You've got to do the maintenance. All of those things bring that fleet to light, if you will, and turn it into actual energy, actual fleet capability. And so I hope I've painted a picture then of naval power composed of elements. And it is that wholeness, right? It's unless you have all those elements present, you're not talking the full dimensionality of naval power, all right? And if you think about just naval power in its entirety, it moves us away from some of these, I would call them false choices that we often get tangled up in our conversations, right? So if we think about, capacity versus capability, okay? Well, certainly there may be some trade-offs there, but they both contribute to naval power, right? They're both needed to be truly powerful in the maritime domain. Standalone technologies versus network, right? Mission command versus networked command. It's both, and you've got to navigate your way in that space dynamically. Okay, and so there's these trade-offs that when you think in terms of naval power, we can elevate our thinking above these false choices and concentrate on what's important. It's like I'm going to just go nuke on you for a little. It's like the nucleus of an atom, right? And if you've got the pure element, right, all the parts of that nucleus are there. And so if you think about those 6 dimensions, a bigger fleet, a better fleet, a network fleet, a more talented fleet, an agile fleet with agile concepts of operations, agile command and control, and then a ready fleet, those are the components of the nucleus. If you try and tear one out, you don't have naval power, you have some isotope of naval power, right? Something that's close but not really complete. And as you all know, because I know you've done your nuclear homework, these isotopes are sometimes unstable, sometimes they decay, et cetera, right? It's not the stable element that we want, not the true thing. Okay, as we talk about strategy here, sort of a strategic overview, the strategic components of naval power, my aim is to sort of give you a view through the telescope, right? Not the microscopes. Too often we try and get down into the microscopic detail, and you can miss the strategic direction, the strategic imperative. And as long as we're doing that, I think we do need to take a step back and appreciate another dimension that we have to contend with. Tom alluded to it, and it is, well, we can just sort of summarize it by appreciating the last 18 months of fiscal year 17 and 18. And during that time, we have the longest CR and the 4th longest CR. We have 2 continuing resolutions in that period of time, both of which in the top 5 in terms of length, one of them the longest of all time. During that 18 months, we've operated 5 months with an enacted budget. The rest of the time has been on continuing resolutions. Currently have really no top line and a government shutdown, okay? Just went through that. This type of dynamism also impacts strategic planning and degrades the industrial base and has a strategic effect on not only the Navy the nation needs, but the national security that we need. And most importantly, perhaps, I will tell you that working through this squanders the most precious resource, which is time, okay? We're spending time managing through this churn rather than getting on with the strategic direction we need to maintain. Okay, before I come to a close, I talked about command and control. As we move into this great power competition, as we build a more lethal Navy, as we build more ships with more advanced technology, talented sailors, none of those by themselves are sufficient to respond to today's complex challenges without commanding officers of ships that are focused on competition, focused on building teams that can go out there and compete and win. And so just as we have done throughout our history, we're going to continue to focus on developing commanding officers who are almost literally obsessed with building winning teams, teams that can compete and win again and again on a sustainable basis. That is our business. Right? As I said at the Surface Navy Association, in many ways I envy our sister services, our ground services, because they can go to places like Gettysburg and they can walk the ground. And so many of the features of that battle are still resident there, and you can see the terrain of, just say, for instance, Pickett's Charge, Little Round Top, et cetera. In our business, the winners sink and the losers sail away. And in our business, we want to be that Navy that sails away. So let there be no doubt, in times of triumph, times of turbulence, rough seas, calm seas, our Navy's operating around the world to secure our interests, protect America from attack, protect our prosperity, our influence around the world, ensure our way of life, which has always been linked to the sea in the United States. We are a maritime nation. We hope that by virtue of this construct, we will build the Navy the nation needs, a safe Navy for our sailors, a reassuring Navy for our partners, and a lethal Navy for our enemies. So with that, that's the end of my prepared remarks, and I am eager to take your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Admiral. Some wonderful remarks there. Again, focusing on the national defense strategy and your 6 dimensions there. So kind of following up on that, one of the things I see, hearing your remarks and having read the public version of National Defense Strategy and on your piece for a more agile ConOps, do you see, in what the guidance says, is increased operational predictability, this dynamic force employment, military posture and operations? How do you see this driving how the Navy is going to train and deploy? And you see this changing how we kind of forward deploy some of our forces, both in Pacific and in the Europe region?
Did you say dynamic predictability or unpredictability?
Unpredictability.
Yeah. So I think that going forward, again, you sort of keep that naval power thing as your North Star. And so as we move forward, one of the things that we're going to focus on is making sure that whichever forces we deploy, for whatever missions they are assigned, they're going to be completely ready and certified to be able to go off and do those missions, right? So we'll establish sort of the maximum level of forces that we can generate and offer to the combatant commanders. And then in terms of how we employ that force once it's out there, very fast-moving train, in this regard. And so as we train, certify, and deploy strike groups, some of it goes back to some of these ConOps and technology that they're bringing with them. Really, a very dynamic environment as we move forward into this, this new competitive arena that we're entering. And then in terms of, I think that unpredictability, for our competitors is good as long as, it's sort of strategic predictability and ends up reassuring, our allies and partners. So we'll just have to, figure out how that goes. Always with this, becoming sort of a more lethal, more reassuring Navy as our guiding force there.
Thank you, sir. Another thing that ties into what you said of all these of the nucleus and having all the parts that you have to do.
Was that too much? Was that too technical?
No, I was geeking out on it, sir. So some of the audience may not have, but
Megan, I know, but she followed me right. Okay, all right, I get it.
But it follows up. So, Chairman Whitman, wrote an op-ed in Navy Times a couple days ago. One of the things he tied in there, he said that the Navy needs more ships, more resources, and more time to complete maintenance and training in order to operate the necessary pace the Navy requires. Right. The administration and Congress have both supported the 355 ships, as you said. So we need a bigger Navy, but also, as you've seen, right, we need to store that fleet readiness. Those two demands, kind of both in the resources piece, how do you see yourself able to, working with SECNAV, to simultaneously build the fleet and restore readiness and provide that time?
Right. So, well, first of all, the Secretary of the Navy has been, completely, he's actually out in front of this, right? So he's leading us down this path. And so it's been just terrific to get to know him more and to work closely with him and to exercise, sort of make his vision real. And as we do that, it is sort of you've got to keep this concept of wholeness in mind. So as we build more naval capacity, right, with that comes the need to keep that whole, right? And so the only other consequence is that we build something, if we don't integrate that wholeness from the beginning, it just becomes sort of a latent bill later on, right? For the really, down at the waterfront, at the fleet commander level, they have to deal with that imbalance. And so we've taken on, a much more holistic approach to putting that program together, always mindful that as we increase capacity, as we increase capability, the rest of those, other 5 dimensions, if you will, the readiness has got to come with it. We've got to invest in that as part of the total ownership cost of the Navy.
And tie on to
So
some,
I'm sorry, this gets to that isotope thing, right? If we start to disassociate those, we end up with problems, right? Things that are built that aren't ready to go.
yes, understand. We've been there, not enough sailors and modernization. And to tie up what you said about the 5 of 18 months, with, that we only had a budget the rest of the time under a continuing resolution. And in some of your recent testimony, you said, on a scale of 1 to 10, you said stable and adequate funding was an 11
Right.
on that piece. Are there some key issues that have had of the impact of even the current CR on maintenance and ship recurrent you see in fiscal year 18? And going
Absolutely. In fact, maintenance might be one of the things that takes one of the biggest hits. I mean, doing particularly deep maintenance on a naval vessel, that's a big undertaking, right? It requires planning. It requires anticipating. You got to get started on that early to do it right, to hire the appropriate workers, to buy the appropriate material, all of those things that go into properly maintaining, and we do a lot of modernization in those upkeeps as well to keep those ships relevant in the threat environment they operate in. And so when you have these sort of fits and starts, these uncertainties, you can't write a contract unless you've got the funding to back that up. And so these sorts of things really slide right. They kind of bow wave to the right. And again, you sort of lose that most precious resource, which is time. And so, planning can get shortchanged. The materials don't come at the optimum cost. Workers are very difficult to hire. And some of the talented workers say, hey, listen, this is just too volatile for me, and I'm going to go someplace where it's a little bit more stable. And so a lot of that talent leaves the workforce and may not come back. And so it really starts to have a toxic effect.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I think a lot of the average public doesn't understand the impact of taking these operational ships out of commission for maintenance periods for sometimes years at a time really reduces that number you have available to deploy.
No, you hit it exactly right. So if you think about naval power, a ship that can't go out to sea because it's not maintained, that's not a ship that's delivering naval power, right? Because of that reason. And so again, the importance of keeping that naval power thing as your front and center goal helps you see that.
Great, sir. One thing I'll tie in is that the recent year, the issues with the Surface Naval Force, you had Fleet Forces Command conduct a comprehensive review, and SecNav had the Strategic Readiness Review. And the question I have for you is yourself, and now with Vice Admiral Brown, the new Commander of Naval Surface Forces, what do you see as there's a lot of corrective actions, a lot of things you've already implemented. What do you see as kind of the most important corrective action, I think, to have the quickest turn and biggest effect of fixing those issues?
Yeah, there's a number of things that are kind of moving in parallel. Some of them are moving at different speeds. Some of them are very immediate, so some kind of training things that we can do right away. They don't require a lot of investment. They don't require a lot of time. And so we can get at those fairly urgently, and in fact, a lot of that is already done. I would, if you back up, I think the idea of identifying and sticking to the process for force generation, the maintenance, training, certification strokes that need to happen on a predictable, well, at least a routine base, right? So you got to stick to that plan, if you will, so that you've got that force generation piece in place before you send those forces to sea to execute missions. I would say that that's sort of the biggest idea. Now, there's a lot of components to making that happen. There's command and control implications and training implications, et cetera. But I would say that that's sort of the big idea behind the comprehensive review and the strategic readiness review.
Thank you, sir. Tying into one of the things you said, and again, one of your pillars there of this, kind of increasing capability, and I think it also ties into what the National Defense Strategy said of this reforming the department. I guess I would ask for some of your ideas that you have yourself with the new Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, Acquisition, Secretary Gertz, and SecNav, of how are you going, what are you implementing, what are things you see to speed up innovation and to field some of these new capabilities more rapidly to the fleet? What do you see how that's going to happen?
So first, Secretary Gertz has brought just a tremendous amount of energy and insight into the business coming from SOCOM, where he was the acquisition executive down there. So it's been, again, this new team that's forming is really terrific. The things that we have been doing, I would say one of the most important things is that we're starting to have meaningful conversations with industry and the research and development business earlier on in the process, right? So that the idea is that we're just going to have a system that can get to the sweet spot between requirements, what is technically achievable at a maturity level where I can make some predictions about cost and schedule that I can stick to. And then take that stroke, right? Make that move. That might involve some prototyping and those sorts of things. We'll get through that phase fast and then get it to the fleet as fast as we can. So this accelerated acquisition program that we've got. And then even as we're delivering that step, Tom, we want to make sure that we are thinking about the next step already, right? And so we get into these fast iterations of capability increase informed by what is technically achievable that allows us to ride that technology curve a lot closer, right? Now we've got to quicken the pace, right? We've got to be doing those iterative steps a lot more quickly than we are right now. And so we're starting to do that. So as we think about families of underwater unmanned vehicles, families of missile systems where we're moving forward, the MQ-25, our unmanned aircraft, carrier-based aircraft, has been moving quickly. I would say that the new frigate is adopting some of those features as well. And then, I look forward to leveraging all of that into a future service combatant. So there's a number of different things that we're doing. This directed energy business that I talked about at the podium, all of those things are kind of in the fast lane and using these new techniques. And then, Secretary Gertz is educating us all about, other ways to get this done as well.
Tying with that is, specifically you mentioned in your remarks talking about how artificial intelligence, machine learning, that unmanned teaming, how it can help that OODA loop, and also the integration of unmanned systems in there. With so much of that work in research and development happening in a lot of those systems out in the commercial world, is how is the Navy integrating with the commercial industry to bring in their ideas and kind of insert their technology rapidly?
Well, we work with a lot of commercial partners, private sector partners, just as a matter of routine. And so that's not anything new, really. It's bringing the team together earlier, right, is really the key. And so, a model where we would have maybe a set of requirements officers, locked in a room until they come up with their set of requirements, white smoke comes out and they come out with, okay, here it is, right, here's the thing. And industry takes a look at that and says, well, that's terrific, except there's nothing that can do that right now. I got to go invent that. Well, that's time and uncertainty and translates to money. If you bring sort of the technologists in, then you can do some really good work to find something that's executable. And then again, Tom, you got to have that fast iteration in place as well. I'll tell you, a very rich part of that, and it's I think indicative of a shift of some parts of the innovation base in the country, where it maybe used to be all DoD-led, classified, et cetera. A lot of times the leading agents, the leading edge of that is out in the commercial sector.
Exactly.
We just have to be fast followers, fast adopters, and so depending upon what we're talking about, we have to be agile to respond to both.
Thank you, sir. So I don't want to take up all the time with my questions, so I'd like to ask some questions from the audience. So wait for, when you get the microphone, sir, state your name, where you're from, and then your question.
And a current giant naval thinker, right, Rami?
I didn't say that, sir.
All right, well, I did.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your comments today. You began, as you often do, by talking about the number of ships that are deployed. And roughly, there are about the same number of ships deployed now as there were during the Cold War, when we had a Navy that was at least twice as large, if not more than twice as large. And I guess the essence of my question is going to be, are we trying, I still say are we trying to do too much with too little? And a few threads there. Bob Work has written and commented over the past several months that we should possibly deploy fewer places, deploy less often, and concentrate on the high-end threat. When Admiral Roden spoke over at SNA a couple of weeks ago, just before you did, he said the solution to some of the problems that the surface force faces is more ships, but it takes a long time to build more ships, and more time, fewer distractions, or what, I don't know if he used the word distractions.
Not a bad word.
Obligations, I think he said. Fewer obligations.
I would say an obligation is different than a distraction.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Obligations. And then when you spoke a couple hours later, you said one of your responsibilities was to I think, to lessen those obligations, or maybe to remove distractions. It comes down at the end of the day, I think, to not doing too much with too little. How do we free up the Navy,
Yeah.
as Bob Work has suggested, to concentrate on the high end fight?
Right.
How do we have more time for training to make sure that when the ships do deploy, and to deploy to the right place, that they're ready to go? So are we trying to do too much with too little?
Right. That's it's sort of the fundamental question, right? And so some of that, those ratios that you described in terms of number of ships deployed versus the number of ships in the battle fleet, some of that can be achieved because we actually do get more efficient and we build some of that efficiency in. And so, but we're seeing that you got to be careful. You can go too far, right? And you can stretch too thin. And so the art here, and maybe it's not even an art as much as a science, is to figure out what is that sustainable level, and that's work we're checking right now, so that we don't reach that point where it's an unsustainable pace, right? So that's kind of at the greatest, most fundamental level. Generally, what you have in this force generation business is you have a cycle, and the Optimized Fleet Response Plan is an example of one of those cycles where you have a period of that cycle where you're preparing and readying the force, and then you have a period of that cycle where the force is ready and certified and it goes off and sustains that readiness in operational contexts. And so, again, I go back to naval power, more lethal Navy. If you think about what we do to employ that force, always with keeping increasing lethality in mind, well, it might change how you employ that force. And so if you're going to forward deploy, let's say make sure that we're getting something real, measurable out of that time on station, that when we do that, we've got a mind towards maintaining that readiness that we have invested in and built up. And then maybe we bring it back and we do a high-end exercise in the Virginia Capes areas with the aggregated strike group. And the combination of that not only makes us, I think, less predictable, but also in the aggregate might make us more lethal as a fighting Navy, particularly at the aggregated level. And then finally, you talked about distractions. That can get down to the very personal level, right? So what are my officers, chief petty officers, sailors doing with their time on a day-to-day basis? And I want them always coming in thinking about, okay, on their drive into work or as they're getting ready to go on watch at sea, what am I going to do today to confound our enemies, our competition? And at the end of the day, as they're driving home or before they put their head down on that rack, they could say, what did I do today, right? And what might I do tomorrow? And if we can remove any distractions from that focus, and this stuff sort of builds up in non-competitive environments or less competitive environments, we really got to cut through that. So we're starting to take a look at the collateral duties that have accumulated and slashing some of those so that we can get our leaders down at the deck plate level, at the personal level, more time to focus on leadership and command and those sorts of things. So all the way from sort of the largest Navy down to sort of the fighting element down to the personal level, we're trying to remove those distractions.
But there, Megan. So. Thank you. Megan Eckstein with USNI News. To go back to Tom's question about how the budget environment affects your ability to kind of keep that nucleus together, NAVC has talked about how they're now contracting for modernization periods with multiple years money rather than maintenance availabilities where it's only 1 year money. Are there other ways the Navy's sort of adapting how it does business to keep that nucleus together with the kind of weird budget environment, or are you really stuck in some areas where you just need stable funding?
Well, I mean, we do need stable funding, right? But the system has adapted, Megan, as you know. So, and I wouldn't say in completely healthy ways, but sort of ways to just kind of get business done. And so, for instance, we don't put a whole lot of important things at risk in the first fiscal quarter, right? Because we're just, we rarely have a budget there. It's been 9 years and we haven't had one. And so you know, that we sort of minimize risk there. We're coming up on Super Bowl week, and I know that there's a lot, everybody in the room has a position on that competition, but I know that in competition that's that close, you can't expect a team to win if they only play 3 quarters out of 4, right? And that's kind of what our fiscal environment is asking us to do in many ways. We talked about the time penalty. There's the staffing penalty. A lot of the contracts that we talked about have to be written twice, you know, for those periods of time. And so we're adapting, but it's really, you can do some things, particularly with multi-year money, but we have to be very, we have to have this dialogue with Congress and make sure that we just have a meaningful discussion about this so that, nobody's surprised. We have on our side an obligation to, prove our reliability, I suppose, as we move forward. And so, we do the best we can, I think, to try and get after that. Also, going back to this wholeness concept, the way that we bring the program together, starts with our strategic direction, and then we've got a very integrated approach, which includes keeping that nucleus intact all the way through the process. And then at the end, we check our homework, right? So if we started with a particular vision in mind, it goes through all the machinations. We want to make sure that the thing at the end of that process looks like what we started with. And so that process and getting all of our leadership connected very closely with the fleet helps us to keep that in balance so that when these things happen, we can with much more agility navigate the trade space of whatever the budget environment sends us.
One last question. Miss there in the red.
Lee Hudson, Inside the Navy. You mentioned earlier about how Congress authorized 13 ships in FY18, and I was hoping you could talk about...
I'm not sure I did say that, but anyway.
Oh, I thought you did, that they put
Go
in,
ahead.
but they didn't appropriate the funding. I thought that's what you said. But anyway, so I wanted to hear the concrete steps the Navy has actually taken to grow the fleet. And I know that the president, mentioned on the campaign trail the 350-ship Navy. If you could give us examples of that.
Well, I think a lot of that is pending, right? So when we get an 18 budget and then, the subsequent budgets, I think that's news still to come. I mean, it'd be premature to talk about it now. Okay. All right.
One last question. The gentleman right there. Wait for that.
So you spoke at length a little bit about strategy towards the end of your prepared remarks there. Two-part question with that. Where, you talked about maritime choke points. One of the most important ones is the GI-UK gap, which I know is one of the issues that the Navy faces right now. Is it is vastly understaffed at the moment, and there's not really a NATO strategy at the moment with regards to the North Atlantic to combat incursions from the Bering Sea. And so I was curious where that plays into the strategy going forward, and then also where does the LCS program and the Zumwalt destroyer program going forward play into making that more technologically advanced Navy, but also one that obviously is prepared going forward to meet those fast, agile requirements, which you mentioned as well.
Okay, so 2 completely different questions. It's not a 2-part question. It's really just 2 questions. Well played. Well, I'll tell you, with respect to the North Atlantic and sort of the resurgent Russia challenge, I don't know if I would agree that we're vastly understaffed for that, particularly in undersea forces, which is the GIUK gap. That's what you're talking about there. We enjoy a window of superiority that's really fact and evidence-based. NATO, I think, is addressing these challenges as well. And so, I talk very often with both General Scaparrotti and Clive Johnstone, MARCOM, and so that's a dynamic and responsive environment to this emerging threat in the maritime domain. And so I'm actually pretty optimistic that that is responding with agility. With respect to these combatants that you mentioned, they've got a big part in our future Navy, both the LCS, small surface combatant moving to a frigate, and then also the Zumwalt. And so both from a technological standpoint in terms of moving us forward, but also in an operational employment standpoint, we've done a lot to rationalize the LCS program, make each one of those platforms as lethal as we can. They're going to play important parts of our Navy going forward. Each one has become more capable on delivery with fewer problems. So we're coming through the engineering and design issues, and as we do with every single new shipbuilding program, we sort of learn our way forward. And so those are going to play a big role, particularly with that agility part. And they're going to, and each one of those platforms plays its role in the team, right? So we don't need to make every ship do everything, right? And so they'll be employed sort of consistent with their capability. Okay.
All right, well, we're out of time today, but I thank the Admiral for coming today.
All right, thanks, Tom.
And I thank everyone in the audience for joining us today.
All right.